Hello to all who are joining us. We'll start the webinar in just a moment. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Jeff Milder. I'm the Director of the Accountability Framework Initiative, or AFI. This session is the latest installment in our webinar series on the accountability framework and how it can be applied in a variety of contexts. Today, our focus is on the topic of setting and achieving supply chain commitments. A few housekeeping points before we begin. We're recording today's webinar, and you'll receive a link shortly to this recording afterwards. It will also be available on the AFI website along with the slides. We have a very brief post-event survey that will pop up after we conclude the webinar. Very much welcome your feedback. This is an Ask the AFI webinar format, so we very much invite your questions. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit any questions you have during the session, and we'll get to those after my initial presentation. The chat function is disabled for this session. So I'll be providing an initial presentation around 20 or 25 minutes, and then we'll have our Q&A period. And during the Q&A, I'll be joined by my AFI colleagues, Leah Sandberg and Adrian Brown. So before we dive into the topic of the day, first, a bit about us. The AFI is a collaborative initiative to establish a new normal of responsible supply chains that are protective of forests, other natural ecosystems, and their values, as well as the human rights of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and workers. At the heart of this collaboration is our coalition of 22 diverse environmental and human rights organizations from around the world. And expanding from this core, we also work with dozens of other partners to strengthen and align action toward the goal of mainstreaming responsible supply chains. Our core product is the accountability framework, and this provides a common global reference for achieving this broad transition to responsible supply chains. The framework addresses each of the key action areas that are integral to this transition, beginning with setting clear and strong goals, establishing company-wide systems to put these goals into practice, managing how commodities are produced, sourced, and traded, collaborating with other stakeholders, for instance, in sourcing areas and landscapes, and then finally monitoring, verifying, and reporting progress. So the accountability framework reflects the consensus of our entire coalition, and it's also aligned with most other major international norms, standards, and market expectations in this space. So it offers this broad view of how to achieve responsible supply chains that's applicable across all forest risk commodities and all portions of the supply chain. The framework has been used by hundreds of companies as well as financial institutions to guide how they set policies, take action, and report progress towards achieving responsible supply chains and addressing environmental and social risk. It's also been used by industry, government, and multi-stakeholder initiatives in order to develop aligned policies on these topics and to be able to move more quickly to implementation. And it's also supported alignment within the reporting and assessment environment so that there's a common definition and metrics of how to assess corporate performance in order to create clear goalposts and strong accountability for all actors working in this space. So with that brief overview of who we are and sort of the role of the AFI, let's move on to the topic of the day. Setting company goals and commitments has been a key focus of the accountability framework since it was first published in 2019. This topic is covered at a high level in the accountability framework core principles 1 through 3. So those principles address the protection of forests and other natural ecosystems, respect for human rights, and also good practice for clear specification of company commitments. More recently, as companies and other stakeholders were working with this guidance, many questions have arisen about this topic, and so we saw the need for additional, more detailed guidance. We began developing this guidance in 2024. We presented it for public consultation early last year, and then last month, so in December 2025, we published this new AFI operational guidance on commitments and progress pathways. As with all of the framework, this reflects the consensus of our entire coalition. So my presentation today will first cover some of the more foundational aspects of this topic that had already been specified in the core principles going back to when the framework was first published. And then we'll dig a bit deeper into this topic, including highlighting some key aspects of the recently published operational guidance. To begin, it's helpful to clarify some terminology on this topic. So the accountability framework defines commitments as public statements of intention to meet specific goals or targets. And in this context, we're referring to statements of intention, referring to the protection of forests and other natural ecosystems, human rights, or other social and environmental values. Commitments can include both broad goals as well as more specific targets. Goals outline intended future outcomes at a high level, whereas targets define specific, measurable, and time-bound performance levels that a company intends to achieve. The guidance also uses the concept of progress pathways, and this refers collectively to the sequence of actions and performance improvements through which a company advances towards fulfilling its commitments. So that includes how the step-by-step sequence and timeline that is identified in advance through milestones, which are time-bound steps towards fulfilling commitments, as well as action plans, which detail how the company intends to move towards each milestone and ultimately towards fulfilling the commitment. Progress pathways also refer to then how this progress is documented and reported after the fact. And so those are some concepts that I'll refer to throughout the presentation. The accountability framework details what is expected as part of a strong company commitment on the topics within the framework scope. So regarding commitments on no deforestation and no conversion, these two commitments can be specified either as a single comprehensive commitment that addresses all forms of natural ecosystem conversion, or it can be laid out as two separate commitments, one addressing no deforestation and one addressing any other ecosystem types that are relevant to where the company does business, such as peatlands or savanna. Companies should cover the different types of natural ecosystems and biomes where the company does business. And this includes both primary and secondary natural forests. It includes both legal and illegal deforestation and conversion, as well as addressing the conversion of natural forests to tree plantations. Commitments should also specify cutoff dates, and this provides clarity and specificity regarding the date after which deforestation or conversion would render any given production unit non-compliant with the commitment. Finally, commitments should also include appropriate measures to support long-term protection of ecosystems in and around production areas, as well as remedy of past conversion occurring after cutoff dates. This is especially important for companies that own or manage production sites and other land, as they directly control or influence these outcomes. On the human rights side, the accountability framework specifies the scope and provides details on commitments to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, the rights of workers, and also the rights and protection of environmental and human rights defenders. Commitments on human rights should also specify some key operational and procedural details to clarify what the company is committing to. So this includes a commitment to follow international human rights instruments, including the International Bill of Human Rights, and conducting business consistent with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It includes a commitment to conduct human rights due diligence across the entire business, to secure free, prior, informed consent where activities may affect the rights of indigenous peoples or local communities, and also to provide remedy where needed. So this is, again, sort of pretty foundational material from the framework about the topical scope of company commitments. The framework also provides guidance on the form and specification of commitments, and additional detail on these aspects is also provided in the newly released guidance document. So broadly, the goal is that commitments should be clear and precise so that all stakeholders understand what the company is committing to. First, this requires commitments clearly stating the intended outcomes. So, as I just mentioned, the protection of forests and other natural ecosystems, as well as respect for human rights. What this means is that if a company is intending to take specific actions or use specific implementation tools, such as, for instance, use of a certification program or a monitoring tool, these can certainly be specified in a commitment, but those details should complement and not replace a clear statement of the outcomes themselves. Language describing the intended outcomes should be specific and objective, and avoid vague or aspirational statements, as well as subjective or ambiguous caveats or carve-outs, such as committing to something where commercially viable is language that we've seen before. Commitments should include clear and standard definitions on all the matters covered, such as those provided by the accountability framework, which companies are encouraged to use. I'll get to this a bit more in a moment. Commitments should also include time-bound targets in addition to broad goals. And where appropriate, these targets can be tailored to different portions of the company's business. Finally, if any aspects of the commitment are changed or revised over time, if the company needs to update its goals or targets, the reasons for the changes should be clearly explained, including any new evidence, business developments, or other factors that led to the adjustments. Another key point in commitment setting has to do with the scope of company commitments relative to the scope of the company's business. The accountability framework states that commitments should apply broadly across the company's operations, supply chains, and financial investments related to agricultural and forestry commodities. Broad scope signals that the company intends to address environmental and social risks and impacts comprehensively as opposed to selectively. And this is important not only for those environmental and social values, but also for signaling that the company is taking a broad approach to addressing associated business risk. And so broad scope means that commitments apply to all operations and land holdings, all commodities and sourcing origins, different forms of commodities purchased, including, for instance, commodity volumes embedded in animal feed, different types of suppliers, both direct and indirect, and product lines, all the various business units defined to be part of the corporate group, which is a concept that the AFI defines, and also all activities that finance or support commodity production. So that's what we mean by broad scope. If there are any exclusions in the scope, those should be justified with clear evidence. So now we've kind of completed the 101 level of the course. We've covered some basics around commitment setting as specified in the accountability framework. And now we'll go a bit deeper with a focus on the new operational guidance that was recently published. As I mentioned, the development of this guidance was really spurred in large part by questions that were coming to us from many companies and stakeholders. And many of these questions pertain to 2025 target dates as companies were realizing that that date was approaching and wanted to know, really how they should be thinking about that and what they should be doing next. So questions, for instance, how should companies approach target setting post 2025? What does it mean to fulfill a commitment and sustain that achievement over time? What should a company do if it had a 2025 target that it didn't fully meet? And also whether there's any real kind of distinctions or differences in how these questions are approached depending on the type and nature of the company in question. So we'll dig a bit deeper into these topics before we move into the Q&A. The first point I want to cover here is appropriate timeframes for implementation and achievement. So especially now that 2025 is in the rearview mirror. We no longer have that round number as a future date. Um, Companies seek clarity on what constitute appropriate timeframes for committing to address deforestation, conversion, and human rights. Broadly, the framework states that timeframes should be as ambitious as possible, while also supporting inclusion and driving lasting improvement on the ground. As the balancing of these factors may depend on multiple factors, this is where the level of detail provided in the guidance is helpful. In the realm of commitments to no deforestation and no conversion, there are a number of guidelines that can help us here. For instance, science-based target setting frameworks for climate and nature provide specific parameters for how companies can determine appropriate timeframes in line with science and align with global goals. Targets, of course, should also align with and fulfill relevant laws and be aligned or informed by broad sector commitments. In the realm of human rights, the approach to kind of time-bound implementation is a bit different in the sense that companies have an obligation to respect human rights at all times. So they shouldn't be making forward date commitments to respect human rights. However, recognizing that implementation may be an ongoing process, it can be appropriate to define time-bound milestones for the implementation of human rights measures. Additionally, the guidance provides further detail on the possibility of phasing implementation measures and expected achievement levels for different portions of the business. For instance, this could include different timeframes for different commodities, geographic origins, or types of suppliers. Phasing can refer either to taking different measures at different periods in time for different segments of the business, prioritizing implementation where there's the greatest impact and risk, and also specifying different timelines for achievement. And the guidance provides further detail on when and how it may be appropriate to specify such phasing. One of the main developments in the new guidance document is placing increased emphasis on year-to-year progress, as opposed to only addressing long-term multi-year targets. And this really reflects a learning from prior periods in time where in the past there was much prominence given to target dates such as 2020 or 2025, but overall not enough focus on the year-on-year steps needed to meet those targets. So as those dates approached, many companies discovered that things were not as far along as they needed to be. So for that reason, this guidance provides increased emphasis on both milestones and action plans to define those year-on-year progress pathways. In this context, milestones are predefined time-bound checkpoints to define and track steps towards full achievement of commitments. They can include both interim progress levels. For instance, if a company is committed to 100% deforestation-free sourcing, there may be a quantitative milestone towards that at a given point in time. Milestones can also include completion of key actions and deliverables, such as conducting risk assessment and supply chain mapping for all origins. As I mentioned, complementing milestones are year-on-year action plans for year-on-year progress. These are critical for translating commitments into sequenced activities with corresponding responsibilities and resource allocations. Typically, action plans should cover multiple years in order to provide that forward visibility on how the company intends to progress stepwise towards its ultimate goals and targets, but also should be updated annually in order to manage adaptively and make changes as needed. We also receive many questions about what it means to fulfill a commitment. Some of these questions have come from companies such as consumer goods manufacturers that, for instance, have set goals to no deforestation and largely implemented these goals across their business, but have found that there remains a small portion of their sourcing that they're not able to demonstrate as being compliance. And this may be due to data gaps or to the inherent dynamism that exists in large supply chains. These questions also come from companies or financial institutions that may be interested in setting new commitments, but they want to make sure that those are defined and worded in a way that is actually realistic and achievable. So in both those contexts, there's value in defining what it means to fulfill a commitment. For supply chain companies that produce or source commodities, fulfilling a commitment requires both of two things. First is that in terms of the materials produced and sourced, that all or nearly all of those materials are compliant with the company's commitments and obligations at any given point in time. Secondly, that the company has effective systems and processes to maintain high performance levels over time. So what this means is there's not an automatic assumption that every molecule needs to be compliant, but at the same time, there need to be systems for making sure that performance and compliance are able to be sustained over time. When it comes to investors and lenders, financial institutions, the guideline here is a little bit different in the sense that financial institutions don't directly produce or source commodities. So the guideline here is that these institutions should have monitoring, engagement, and management practices for the companies with whom they do business that address those parameters around product volume compliance and company systems. And these systems for monitoring, engagement, and management apply across the entire portfolio of supply chain companies with whom the financial institution does business. Finally, the guidance addresses what a company should do if it misses a target or milestone. In this case, the priorities are to maintain ambition towards fulfilling the commitment, continue working expeditiously to close any remaining gaps, and to be transparent with stakeholders regarding the amount of progress that was made, why the commitment was not fully achieved, and what the company plans to do next to close that gap. So more specifically, this includes retaining the overall broad commitment and goal to achieve the originally stated outcomes. Time-bound targets and milestones, even if they're in the past and were not met, should be retained in public view at least until the end of the reporting period for the given target. And it's good practice to maintain a publicly available record of prior targets indefinitely. Companies should clearly communicate the reasons for missing the target or milestone, whether this is due to unforeseen circumstances or technical barriers or other reasons. They should develop and publish a revised action plan for closing the remaining gaps, including clear milestones. And then finally, provide frequent monitoring as well as annual reporting so that those gaps can be closely monitored and assessed and communicated and progress communicated transparently to stakeholders. In addition to the broad guidance points that I've just summarized, the operational guidance also provides a complementary level of detail on how to apply this guidance for different types of companies. And this recognizes that there are differences in how different types of companies are able to directly control or influence environmental and human rights impacts on the ground based on the different forms of control or leverage that they might have. So the annex to this guidance provides additional detail for 5 types of companies. That includes 3 types of supply chain companies, producers, traders, and other companies acting as first buyers, and then downstream buyers, as well as 2 types of financial institutions, or 2 roles for financial institutions. Those that are providing direct finance to production units or other land-based assets, such as banks, and then investors or other financial institutions that hold other types of assets, such as publicly traded shares and companies. This material, we certainly encourage readers to consult this as it may be relevant for their own organization or an organization they're working with. Now I'd like to move us into the second part of this webinar, where we will welcome your questions on this topic. I'm glad to be joined here by my colleague Leah Sandberg, lead scientist for the AFI, and Adrian Brown, our senior manager, who will be moderating the session and posing questions that all of you have asked. And just as a final word for this Q&A session, this, of course, is a public webinar, so we encourage you to ask questions that are relevant to you, but also likely to be of interest to others. If you have individualized questions that pertain more to your specific situation, we invite you to contact us through our contact form if you'd like to ask something that's more specific, or even better, we would encourage you to consider contacting one of the AFI delivery partners. These are service providers and consultancies who are trained and supported to help companies apply and implement the accountability framework, including this new guidance. And they should be able to help you with your specific case. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us for this initial presentation. We hope you'll stay for the Q&A and look forward to hearing and answering your questions. Over to you, Adrian.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. And great to see everyone on here. Let's dive right into our questions. And please note that we will put some links into the chat as well to specific resources and such that we may mention as we're answering these questions. So let's start at the top. Leah, I have one for you. What KPIs can we set to track the progress of our commitments? And do we have any examples of numerical targets that companies should set?
Great. Thanks, Adrian, and thanks for the question. It's a good one. So first, I think before I get into sort of a short answer, I'd point everyone to the Accountability Framework's operational guidance on reporting disclosures and claims, which has quite detailed information on how companies should report clearly and credibly against these commitments. We also have a resource called the Common Methodology for Reporting and Disclosure that provides some recommended indicators, many of which are currently used in reporting platforms such as CDP. I think that those resources may be available in the chat. So more specifically to your question, so I will separate for a second deforestation and conversion commitments and commitments to respect human rights, which include quite different types of indicators. So for no deforestation and no conversion commitments, our guidance, both in the operational guidance and in the other resource that I mentioned, include quite specific numeric metrics for tracking progress towards achieving those goals. Focus of these KPIs is really the proportion of production and sourcing that are deforestation and conversion free. So we have a standardized set of framework aligned metrics that's available on our website as well as via the CDP questionnaire and a lot of other reporting platforms. This includes indicators that describe both the proportion of different portions of the supply chain that are considered to be deforestation and conversion free, as well as the approach used to determine that status. So is that being done via certification? Is it being done via direct monitoring of production units? So it's really helpful not just to report on an overall proportion of DCF volumes, but on the proportion of DCF volumes that's determined by these different approaches. That really provides a huge amount of information for stakeholders. In addition, as Jeff mentioned, in addition to specifically reporting on compliant volumes, reporting on progress towards achieving these commitments should include reporting on the presence and effectiveness of the systems and processes that are used to achieve and maintain compliance. So these include systems to understand supply origins and performance, monitoring systems, mechanisms to protect further adverse impacts and address to non-compliance when it does occur. These can also be reported on in numeric ways in terms of the proportion of the supply chain that are covered by these systems, for example. Disclosure related to human rights commitments is generally less quantitative, but should include reporting on all primary aspects of human rights due diligence. This includes measures to identify and assess adverse impacts, measures to avoid, mitigate, or remedy these impacts, and measures to communicate these activities to stakeholders. So that's sort of a quick snapshot on some of our guidance related to KPIs. Definitely please check out our resources for more information on that topic or reach out to us.
Super. Thank you, Leah. Great. And I have the next question for you, Jeff, is around aims in terms of these commitments. The question is, should we aim for zero deforestation or is low risk sufficient? Could you speak to that aspect, please?
The accountability framework recommends that companies set commitments to no deforestation, and it also outlines the different ways in which companies are able to demonstrate that. So that information is provided in Core Principle 5 and in the operational guidance on supply chain management. So companies can demonstrate no deforestation by tracing and monitoring materials back to origin directly using qualifying certification programs, tracing materials back to sourcing areas that are free of deforestation, or implementing those different measures through their upstream suppliers if those suppliers are able to provide adequate data and evidence on compliance. So there are indeed across large supply chains, many companies are using low risk as a way to do initial screening and management and to be able to focus their efforts on places where risk is higher. And we certainly encourage that as a valid way to move in a stepwise way towards achievement of a full no deforestation commitment.
Great, thank you. Perfect. And then let's talk a little bit more in detail about some of the aspects you mentioned already, Jeff. And Leah, I'm going to ask you to respond to this question. It's about product volumes. How should a high level of product volumes be defined? What is acceptable? Are we looking at 95%, 99%? And maybe added to that, why is it so important to, in terms of fulfilling commitments, to go beyond just product volume compliance as well?
Yeah, great questions that I think really get to the heart of some of what we're trying to unpack in this guidance document. I'll try to give some short answers to that for now, building on what Jeff said earlier. So, with regard to the sort of all or nearly all guidance, we felt it was really important to um, make clear that in a lot of business contexts, maintaining 100% product volume compliance at all times is just not a realistic goal or a goal that could come with trade-offs, for example, for smallholder inclusion or engagement to support improvement in high-risk landscapes. On the flip side, this is not intended to be an allowance for companies to continue with business as usual or to use something like cost or complexity as an excuse to not achieve, these goals and really not to take action where necessary. Um, so the acceptability of shortfalls related to 100%, is it 99%? Is it 95%? Is it 92%? We're not going to give a one answer to that question. If we had one, it would be in the guidance. But I think it's really a question of where are you in the supply chain? What action are you taking to address that small percentage? Is that small percentage going down? Those are really the more important questions. For companies that are further upstream in the supply chain, that have more visibility, that are sourcing less complex volumes, this number should be closer to 100. Action plan should specify how that shortfall is going to reach, the 99% level sooner rather than later. For companies that are further downstream in the supply chain, that are sourcing for more smallholders, that are sourcing more complex volumes, in any of these cases, maybe there's reason why the number below 100% is somewhat larger. Then the question is, okay, are those volumes covered by action plans? Is the company say, all right, we've only got 92%, but it's because that other 8% is in the hands of smallholders that we're working with to improve their practices. So it's less about the exact number and more, what does that number mean relative to what the company's role is in the supply chain? And is that number fully addressed in the milestones and action plans that companies have stated publicly to close that gap? So our guidance provides quite a bit of detail on this, including considerations for sort of assessing both the lack of known compliance and addressing, sorry, both sort of the absence of knowledge about compliance, unknown volumes, untraceable volumes, as well as volumes that are known to be non-compliant but are under sort of improvement processes and things like that. So it's really a question of not sort of, is this the right number, but is this number the right one given where the company sits in the supply chain and what they're doing to close the gap?
Yeah, that context is.
I might add to that just briefly to clarify that because the accountability framework is not a certification or a compliance standard, we're not here to make company-specific determinations about whether a commitment has been fulfilled or not. Ultimately, those assessments need to be made by the company's business partners, investors, and stakeholders. And what we've looked to do in this guidance is provide quite a bit of detail on how those determinations can be made in a way that reflects, what it is that we actually think companies should be doing to drive improvement and mitigate risk on the ground. And that's where the type of detail that Leah just described comes in, which is that it really matters why it is that there's some residual non-compliance. Is it that, the compliant material is available, but the company has chosen not to engage with those suppliers or not to incur those costs? Or is it because they've taken a strategic decision to continue engaging with suppliers to drive improvement, and during the interim period, for instance, they're not able to demonstrate full compliance? So we want to make sure that the companies are being asked to do and held accountable to the things that really matter, and that's what we've laid out in this document.
Mhm. Okay, thanks for that addition, Jeff. And then maybe sticking a little bit with this topic of compliance, Leah, there's a question around how companies should show compliance and whether certifications like RSPO are enough. The question also asks, how can I ensure that raw material poses a risk too? So getting into that question around how risk is determined and the role of risk assessments as well.
Yep, absolutely. So, on the first point about showing compliance, um, so the accountability framework lays out sort of a suite of different ways that companies can indicate compliance with no deforestation, no conversion commitment. So this can include certificates, certifications like RSPO. We have quite a bit of information available around the circumstances under which certification can provide sufficient assurance of deforestation and conversion-free volumes. This includes both the content of the principles and criteria of the certification, as well as the chain of custody mechanism that's used. We have a draft guidance on our website on the use of certification in responsible sourcing, which will probably be published in a more final form in the near future, but is sort of quite a useful existing resource. So I would recommend that folks look at that for more detail about certification. Other ways that companies can show compliance are direct monitoring of operations or of production units in their supply chain. So saying, we use these monitoring tools, here's the methodology we followed, here's how we can demonstrate compliance here. The same is available where companies are sourcing from sourcing areas where it can be shown that there's not a risk of noncompliance. They can say, we're sourcing from this supply shed. We've monitored all the farms there. We can tell that there's no noncompliance happening in this region. And then also companies can use supplier control mechanisms. So if they're sourcing from a supplier that themselves is doing direct monitoring at the farm level, for example, companies can provide that information to their own stakeholders. So a lot of this information is available in our operational guidance on supply chain management. It's different mechanisms that companies can use to demonstrate compliance. The second question was about whether a raw material poses a risk if it's not one of the predefined ones, for example, by the SBTI and UDR. That's a really good question. There's sort of we think of somewhat of a stepwise process here. And I think this is a similar process to what is, for example, provided in the new SBTI guidance that's going to be updated here. So there's a set of known, global drivers of deforestation, a set of global forest risk commodities. These are found in the lists provided by UDR and SBTI, for example. Certainly, if a company is producing or sourcing one of those commodities, those should be included in no deforestation commitments. There are, a longer list of other commodities that do present deforestation or conversion risk for certain companies or in certain geographies that may not rise to the global top, but may be quite significant both in the context of company supply chain or particular location. That is going to require a second level of due diligence and research, or a company is going to need to really look and see, are there other commodities that I'm sourcing in significant amounts? If so, I should look into the impact of that commodity. Or are there other commodities that do, carry significant deforestation risk in certain geographies? Then the company should look into whether or not they're active in those geographies. So there is some amount of due diligence above and beyond that sort of UDR set of commodities that does, sit with the company who's trying to set a comprehensive commitment.
Great, thanks, Leah. And then maybe building on this, what we mentioned already around certification, how that can help. Jeff, pivoting to you for the next question around this. A recent CDP report indicated FSC's controlled wood standard is deemed robust enough to support certification claims based on mass balance as a proof point. In general, how should companies be thinking about using certification in order to fulfill their commitments? And what kind of guidance does the AFI provide on that?
Great. I'll start with an answer to that question, and then I may invite Leah to supplement based on her engagement with CDP on this topic. So, as mentioned, the AFI has a working draft paper on uses of certification and responsible sourcing, and that lays out criteria for evaluating certification systems in terms of whether they're able to demonstrate, for instance, deforestation-free status or other elements of compliance. Right now, generally that's understood in terms of being able to achieve product volume control over materials, which requires using either a segregated, identity preserved, or in some cases, controlled mass balance chain of custody. So using other forms of mass balance are not able to actually show that the materials being purchased come from specific origins, although mass balance can make other contributions to responsible sourcing. So looking at chain of custody, looking at this specific details of the standard, as well as the strength and credibility of the system itself in terms of how it's managed are the main things to be looking for. And Jen, maybe we can add a link to that certification working draft in the chat if we haven't already. That would be a good source to go to for that. Um, CDP also has, I believe, developed some more specific detail on this question of which certification systems can be used to substantiate reporting on deforestation-free compliance. So, Leah, I'm not sure if you want to add anything more on that.
Sure, I can jump in quickly there. So, as I'd mentioned previously, when we worked with CDP to develop a set of indicators for reporting on deforestation and deforestation and conversion of free compliance, it included the question about how that was determined. One of those options is certification. Within that, it provides a list of certification schemes that CDP has determined to provide sufficient assurance of deforestation or conversion-free claims. That is based on a determination that they've made that we did some support on looking at the principles and criteria as well as the chain of custody models. I think that is something that is going to be sort of consistently updated as these schemes, change their criteria, change their models. So I think it's always a work in progress. Currently, they do say that FSC controlled wood provides sufficient assurance. Currently, they say that PEFC does not, largely because of a huge amount of variation in the different national interpretations of that scheme that make it hard for that to be communicated through that form in that question. So that's sort of the current status of how those things are determined via CDP.
Great. Thanks, Leanne. And in terms of updates, I know one that's on everyone's mind and has come into our questions here a few times are SBTI's forthcoming updates to their guidance based on the consultation last year around setting flag targets. Leah, wondering if you can speak to that a bit in terms of and the alignment of those guidance updates with the accountability framework. Specifically, we have a question in the chat around what it means for target dates and how they're going to be set under this new guidance in alignment with the framework.
Yeah, absolutely. I figured that question would come up. It's definitely a important one right now for everyone. So for those who might not be aware, the SBTI is currently in the process of doing some updates in its flag target and guidance regarding the required no deforestation commitment. So as part of SBTI target setting, companies in the land sector need to set a flag target, which is a specific target related to their land sector emissions reduction. In addition to reducing land sector emissions, such as emissions from land use change, companies are also required to set a commitment to no deforestation across their primary commodities. That commitment carries a target date. That target date previously had been set at no later than 2025. Given that that is now behind us, SBTI is updating that language. So the update has not yet been published. It will soon. They just had a consultation this past fall, and they're moving now towards a finalization of the updated guidance. The biggest change is going to be that instead of requiring target dates to be no later than 2025, they now need to be no later than 2 years after the date that the target is submitted. So this allows companies to continue to set SBTI flag targets and to set no deforestation commitments associated with those targets while still looking for a high level of ambition in a short time frame. This is very in line with the Accountability Framework Initiative's guidance on this, as Jeff has laid out, where we're saying it's not about setting a specific target date far in the future. It's about setting an ambitious target date and showing year on year how you're going to get there. So it's really, I think a really good update in line with the spirit of what we're looking for in terms of putting really um, the the putting an ask of companies to say we're not going to set a target date arbitrarily for you in the future. You really need to show us how you're going to get there quickly. So that's sort of the updated target date in that time frame. I think there's going to also be a possibility for companies who have already set those commitments with 2025 target dates to provide an update that's similarly in line with this sort of 2-year moving window. The updates also have some other changes to that no deforestation commitment in addition to the target date. So this includes an increased focus on progress reporting against the no deforestation commitment, which again aligns quite well with our increased focus on milestones and action plans. These updates also provide some amount of further clarity around things like the primary forest risk commodities and the cutoff dates, but they don't really constitute significant changes for companies on that topic.
Great, thanks, Leah. I'm sure that answered a lot of questions on people's minds. And there's a related question in the chat, Jeff, that I'd like to bring to you. And we hear this a lot, that companies are increasingly reluctant to make commitments without knowing in advance how they will meet that. And a lot of times sustainability teams within companies are getting pushback from their legal teams around doing this. How would we advise groups to approach these conversations internally within companies, or perhaps for some of the advisory supporting them? What should their next steps be? A lengthy pre-commitment assessment, and would we encourage the company still to set the commitment and then work towards it and make adjustments as necessary?
That's a great question, and I think I saw at least one other question in the Q&A box on that theme. Um, so addressing this question is actually one of our main priorities for this operational guidance because we recognize that we're in an era right now where there is more scrutiny for setting new commitments within organizations, with legal teams and other stakeholders internally. And so we need to recognize that, and there's good reasons for that. And with the guidance, we wanted to be able to create space for companies to establish and communicate ambition, while also recognizing that there is this scrutiny, and there are valid reasons for companies not to want to put out in public commitments that they're not relatively confident that they can achieve. So there's a few ways that the guidance addresses that. One is to aim to get more precise and specific about different language in which commitments can be formulated and the meaning of that language. So as an example of that, in the detail around what it means to fulfill a commitment, we wanted to clarify that achieving a responsible supply chain does not mean perfection at all times from the standpoint of being able to control all products sourced. It is a systems level approach where the expectation is a high level of performance as well as the systems and mechanisms to sustain that performance over time. In the annex to the guidance document, we suggest some examples of language that companies can use to communicate that. So I think legal teams do have a focus on the precise and exact meaning of words, and we think there's a lot of opportunities there for companies to continue signaling ambition in a way that's also realistic. The second point that is implied in this question and also addressed in the guidance is how can companies signal ambition broadly, even when they might not have enough information to know exactly how or how quickly they can get from point A to point B for different parts of their business. And in that regard, the guidance provides some flexibility. We encourage companies to set broad scope commitments at the level of goals. So that is saying that their intention is uh, to achieve the outcomes of no deforestation, no conversion, and respect for human rights across the business. But in terms of what that looks like for specific commodities or segments of the business, if companies don't have all the information they need at the outset, it is appropriate. It's acceptable to take a bit of time to do risk assessments and supply chain mapping to create that information, and then based on that, to complement those broad goals with more specific time-bound targets. So again, that's another way that the language can be made more precise to signal ambition without being unrealistic. And then the third thing that the guidance does is, recognize that ambition should be ambitious, which means if you're absolutely confident you can meet it, maybe you haven't been ambitious enough, and that means that sometimes things change and timeframes will need to change. And so we provide that route and that sort of protocol for companies to make those changes, to do that in a way that's transparent, that signals what they've accomplished if they've acted in good faith, and be able to do that in a way that's recognized, transparent to stakeholders, maintaining ambition while adapting if needed based on what they've achieved and what they've learned. And so that's the guidance around what to do if a company misses a commitment, how they can communicate transparently about that. We ask companies to maintain existing commitments. For instance, 2025, if you had a target and you didn't fully meet it, in 2026 or early 2027, you would be disclosing on your 2025 performance. Keep that 2025 target in view as a way of enabling stakeholders to understand what was achieved and where the company fell short, and then move on in terms of describing how the remaining gaps will be closed. So put together, we hope that those sort of forms of nuance and flexibility create a landscape where companies can continue signaling ambition, even in the environment of scrutiny that we operate in now.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And we have a few more moments left for some questions. And I want to pivot a little bit to another that has come up around the role of smallholder farmers in these supply chains as companies are looking to set and realize their commitments, both voluntary ones and then what is required under new regulatory frameworks. Jeff, could you also speak to the approaches companies can be taking in terms of managing smallholders and their roles in supply chains?
Sure. So generally, the accountability framework recommends that companies take an inclusive approach to sourcing. And that means that in cases where they source from smallholders, that they should look to continue including those smallholders in their supply chains. If they're sourcing commodities that are produced from smallholders, continue looking for smallholder suppliers of those products. In terms of fulfilling commitments, in some cases, there may be challenges to demonstrating full compliance across the full smallholder sourcing base. This can be due to pre-existing non-compliance. It can be due to lack of capacity among those smallholders to implement changes that are needed, and it can also be due to data gaps. As Leah was mentioning, when it comes to demonstrating progress and fulfilling commitments, we as the companies look at the different segments of volumes where they might not currently be able to demonstrate full compliance, characterize the gaps that exist and how they plan to address those gaps. So, for instance, in a given smallholder sourcing context, if the gap is a data limitation gap, what is the approach to address that? Are they, for instance, going to work through smallholder groups to better organize field level data collection? Maybe they would provide some technical support. If the gap is that within, say, a smallholder cocoa group, there are some suppliers that deforested after a cutoff date, such as 2020. What are some viable strategies to remedy that forest loss? One that's often used is supporting partial reforestation through agroforestry practices. So those are examples of context-appropriate measures that would be responses to smallholder sourcing segments where full compliance may not be able to be demonstrated at the moment. And that's exactly sort of the type of nuance that we provide in this guidance and that we think can continue to support inclusion and allow companies to signal why it is that they're making that choice.
Great, thanks. There's another question. I think it's a really important one on everyone's mind right now. And Jeff, I'd welcome you to start off on this, and then perhaps Leah, you'd like to add in too. The question is, what is the guidance from the framework if the company set a cutoff date that is after 2020, something like 2022 or even 2025? And how should companies be approaching commodities sourced from those lands? Could you speak to the framework's guidance around that in terms of cutoff and target dates?
Sure. So the accountability framework recommends a cutoff date of no later than the end of 2020 for deforestation. When it comes to other natural ecosystems, The framework doesn't set a specific or recommend a specific date, but specifies the cutoff date should be in the past. And that's important because a cutoff date in the future essentially signals to suppliers that they should go ahead and clear all their land now so that they can get it in before the date. So we don't want that. As far as the December 2020 cutoff date for no deforestation, one of the main advantages of this is that when there are many suppliers selling to many buyers, if everyone has different cutoff dates, that makes it quite difficult to manage, to assess, monitor compliance, and convey compliant material throughout the supply chain. So 2020 is the cutoff date that was selected by the EU deforestation regulation. It's embedded in many other international norms and standards. And so it can provide a common basis for demonstrating deforestation-free sourcing across the dynamic sourcing landscape. Um, if companies have set different cutoff dates, then they should be monitoring and reporting against those cutoff dates. For instance, we know in the soy sector, there are some later post 2020 cutoff dates, but most of those cutoff dates are still in the past. So that still serves an important purpose of signaling to producers and suppliers on the ground that future deforestation and conversion is not going to be a good investment, which is one of the main purposes of cutoff dates. I'm not sure if you want to say anything else about that one, Leah.
I think that's clear. Let's try to get one more in maybe.
Perfect. All right, we've got one more question that is around the topic of forest degradation and how the accountability framework looks at this topic in particular. It'll be helpful to speak to that in terms of the scope of the framework.
Sure, I can take that one. So there's I think 3 points I'll make around the topic of degradation. So I think first, the accountability framework focuses on land use change, which is one of many different types of impacts that agriculture and forestry have on the landscape. So the way that the accountability framework deals with degradation in that sense is to say that if there is severe and sustained degradation that really leads to ecosystems composition, structure, and function being significantly and permanently altered, that would be considered to be deforestation or conversion. So one mechanism of deforestation is, go in and cut all the trees immediately. Another could be sort of consistent degradation that leads to the same outcome, which is there's no longer a forest there. So that's sort of one way degradation is already included in commitments regarding no deforestation or no conversion. And the same could be true of non-forest ecosystems as well. So if degradation is severe and sustained enough that it would be considered conversion, it should be included under no deforestation, no conversion commitments. There's also the question of then degradation that is present, is harming ecosystems, is harming ecosystem services, but isn't rising to the level where it would be considered land use change. Two components to that. One is that in this guidance and in our core principles, you'll see that commitments to avoid degradation, or excuse me, to avoid deforestation and conversion should also include commitments to long-term protection of natural ecosystems. So, there are many ways in which good management of lands that are under the company's control or influence, not just considering land use change, but considering long-term health of ecosystems that are under in that company's sphere of influence should be included in those commitments as well. So, there are types of degradation that should be avoided based on those commitments to ecosystem protection. And then finally, there's the question, which is a trickier one of should companies be making commitments to avoid degradation in their supply chain specifically? That's a much harder one. I think it's more specific to forestry and to we're at time. Sorry. I'll cut it off there. Thanks everyone. I'll let Adrian wish everybody a good day, but thanks all so much for being here.
Great. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. You will receive an email with the webinar recording. We also encourage you to check out our website for these resources and to learn more about the accountability framework. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all.